Okay, we're on Lamed Aleph Amid Beis. We're going to start with the words Omar Shmuel, which is about 15 lines up from the bottom. The Mishnah had been talking about the permissibility or lack thereof of dismantling a structure in order to be able to have Simchas Yantiv. In the case of the Mishnah, it was about dismantling a structure which encases produce in order to access the produce. The Chachamim say that it's aser, and Rabbi Meir says that it's permitted. Now we have a statement of Shmuel. Omar Shmuel, chosmo shebekarka matir avolo mafkia velo chosech. That there were ropes that were used to tie down a trap door. And if you have a trap door, let's say in the ground, that where you is the entrance to your cellar, and you want to be able to open it to access the materials there, so then you're only allowed to untie the rope, but you're not allowed to lost my English. You can't cut the rope, and you can't
unravel it.
Unravel. Thank you. You can't unravel it on Yantiv. And shebekele matru mafkia v'chosech. But if it's a rope that is tying up a utensil, so it's not mechuber lekarka, it's not real estate, but rather it's chattel. And we know that the laws of construction and deconstruction are not as machmir when it comes to kalim. So then you're allowed to untie the rope, you can cut the rope, and you can unravel the rope. Echad Shabbos ve'echad Yantif, and there's no difference between Shabbos and Yantif in these halachas. So now let's challenge that. Meisvei. Chos Moshe bekarka b'Shabbos matir avolo mafkia v'lo chosech. Here the Brisa distinguishes between Shabbos and Yantif, and it says that on Shabbos, if you've got the rope on the trap door, you're allowed to untie it, but you cannot unravel or cut it. B'Yom Tov matir umafkia v'chosech. But on Yantif, for the trapdoor, you're allowed to do everything. And that's a kasha on Shmuel, because Shmuel is machmir. And he says that you're not allowed to do that even on Yantif. So the Gemara says, Hamani Reb Meiri da Amar Av Poches Lechatchila V'Notel. That explains the Gemara that Shmuel holds like the Chachamim, and this latter brisa goes according to Reb Meir, who says you are allowed to dismantle on Yantif for the purpose of Simchas Yantif in order to access your produce. And the same thing would be true. He would hold that you're allowed to dismantle the rope, do an act of dismantling or deconstruction in order to access your produce in the cellar. Upligi Rabbanan alevana darmika Rabbanan. The Rabbanan argue, and I hold like the Rabbanan. So now the Gemara asks, Sumi pligi Rabbanan alei b'chos Moshe bekarka. Since when do the Chachamim argue with Reb Meir when it comes to these ropes that are tying down a trapdoor on the ground? The Hatanya would look at the following brisa: Modim Chachamim l'Reb Meir b'chos Moshe bekarka sheb'Shabbos matir v'lo mafkia v'lo chosech b'Yom Tov matir mafkia v'chosech. The brisa says explicitly that the Chachamim agreed to Reb Meir that even though on Shabbos we're more machmir, but on Yantif, because of Simchas Yantif, we will allow you to completely dismantle the rope and to cut it and unravel it as well. So the Gemara says, Huda Amar, so Shmuel has another brisa. Ki haitana detanya chos Moshe bekarka matir avalo mafkia v'lo chosech echad Shabbos ve'echad Yantif. So you see, this brisa says that when it's a rope that's tying down the trapdoor, then it doesn't make a difference whether it's Shabbos or Yantif. You're not allowed to unravel or cut it. You can only untie it. So you see very clearly that this is the brisa that Shmuel will subscribe to. V'shebekli b'Shabbos matir avalo mafkia v'lo chosech b'Yom Tov matir mafkia v'chosech. Now the second part of the brisa says as follows: when you're dealing with a utensil, then on Shabbos you're only allowed to untie it, but you're not allowed to unravel or cut. And on Yantif you're allowed to cut it, untie it, unravel it, whatever you want to do. So the Gemara says, Taratzta l'chareisha elaseifa kasha. So 1 second, says the Gemara. You've explained Shmuel, the first part of Shmuel's statement is consistent with this brisa. But the second part of Shmuel's statement is not consistent with this brisa, because if you go back to Shmuel's statement, what did he say? He said that when it comes to utensils, then it makes no difference whether it's Shabbos or Yantif, you're allowed to cut it, unravel it, whatever you want. And this brisa says that that only on Yantif are you allowed to do that, but on Shabbos you're not allowed to. So how do you reconcile the two? So the Gemara says, Hamani Rabbi Menachem Yehi. So answers the Gemara, this latter statement of the Brisa goes according to Rabbi Nechemia. Da Amar Kol HaKelim Eini Tolan Ela Derech Tashmisha. So the Gemara explains like this: this is not a problem of dismantling. This is not a problem of dismantling. What is Rabbi Nechemia's position over here? Only the second part of the brisa goes like Rabbi Nechemia. He holds that you have a separate problem. How do you cut a rope? You cut a rope with a knife, or a scissors, or whatever, any sharp instrument. Rabbi Nechemia has a unique shita when it comes to the laws of muktzah. Something that we really is not very commonly discussed in the Gemara. Usually we're used to discussing Rabbi Yehuda, who's machmir in muktzah, Rabbi Shimon is mekel in muktzah, Rabbi Nechemia is really machmir in muktzah. And he says that even kalim can be muktzah if you want to use them for their non-designated purpose. Let's say I want to use a spoon as a toy. According to everyone except for Rabbi Nechemia, that's fine. You want to use a spoon, pick it up off of your place setting and use it to pacify the little baby on your lap, no problem. According to Rabbi Nechemia, you're not allowed to pick up a spoon unless you want to eat soup with it. If you want to use the spoon for anything else, it's usher. So this statement of the brisa that you're not allowed to cut the rope on Shabbos is not because of dismantling, but because you're not allowed to pick up a knife for a non-designated purpose. Using the steak knife is for cutting steak, not for cutting rope.
This is for Shabbos?
This is for Shabbos. So the Gemara is going to ask another question. The Gemara is going to ask, well, what about Yantiv? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Nechemia, my ear Shabbos afilu Yantiv nami. So this is exactly the Gemara's question. Well, then why is it only Aser on Shabbos? According to Rabbi Nechemia, that law is applicable equally to Yom Tov, because v'chitei mashanya leila Rabbi Nechemia ben Shvus Shabbos l'Shvus Yom Tov. Maybe you'll say no. Rabbi Nechemia is only machmir in this regard on Shabbos, but not on Yom Tov. U'mishanya le. Since when is there such a difference? V'hatani chada masikin bekelim ve'ein masikin b'shivrei kelim. V'tanya idach masikin bein bekelim bein b'shivrei kelim. V'tanya idach ein masikin lo bekelim v'lo b'shivrei kelim. We have three separate brises. Each brisa contradicts the other. The first brisa says that on Yantif, if you want to fuel your fire, you can use intact utensils, let's say earthenware utensils that are combustible, but you can't use broken vessels that were broken from before Yantif, that were broken on Yantif because they're muktzah. The second brisa says you can use both intact and broken utensils. The third brisa says you can use neither intact or broken utensils. So umeshani lokasha hareb Yehuda hareb Shimon hareb Nechemia, and the way that we reconcile the three brises is there are three different tanoim. The first brisa, who says only use intact vessels but not broken vessels, is Rabbi Yehuda, who's machmir in the laws of muktzah, and since this was not designated from before Yantif as a broken vessel, you can't use it. It's muktzah. The second brisa, which says you can use both, is Reb Shimon, who's very liberal with the laws of muktzah. The third brisa is Rabbi Nechemia, who says that you can't even pick up the jug to use it as fuel because that's its non-designated purpose. You can't use either intact or broken utensils. So therefore you see that Rabbi Nechemia holds this way by Yantif as well. Why then does the brisa distinguish between cutting the rope on Shabbos and cutting the rope on Yantif? According to Rabbi Nechemia, they should be equally aser. Answers the Gemara, Trei Tanoi va'aliba de Rabbi Nechemia. The answer is that there are two opinions as to how Rabbi Nechemia holds. One brisa cites Rabbi Nechemia as only being machmir on Shabbos, and that's that former brisa which said that you're not allowed to cut the rope on Shabbos, but you can cut it on Yantif. The latter brisa goes according to another Tana who cites Rabbi Nechemia as being equally machmir both on Shabbos and on Yantif. Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Ein pochasin es haner mipnei shehu osa kli. So the first statement of the Mishnah is that you're not allowed to create a concave receptacle in a soft piece of clay on Yantif in order to be able to, let's say, hold the oil for a candle. You're not allowed to do that because you're creating a kli. And ve'ein osin pechamim b'yamtiv, you're not allowed to make charcoal on Yantif. The Gemara will explain why you would want to make charcoal on Yantif, what function it has. And the reason why is because charcoal is like a utensil. It has a utility, and therefore it's like creating a utility utensil or object on Yantif, and therefore it's aser. Next. You're not allowed to cut a wick that's too long in order to make it usable for a candle. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Choscha Ba'or, and Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, And he says that as long as you don't cut it with a knife, but you instead cut it by using a fire to ignite it and let it burn in half, so then it's okay. So we're going to analyze all three cases. Mantana de bechisas ner manahu. Who holds that actually just creating an indentation in a soft piece of clay is the creation of a kli? Amar Rav Yosef Rabbi Meir. That goes according to Rabbi Meir. The Tanya kli cheres me'emosai mekabel tuma mishenigmar malachto div Reb Meir. Because Reb Meir, as the Brisa says, when does an earthenware vessel become subject to tuma? Meaning, when does it become a kli? Once it's been completely fashioned. Meaning you don't have to harden it in the kiln. Even if it's still soft, it's still called a kli. And Rabbi Yeshua Omer Mishi Yitzarfu Bekibshin, he says no. You have to, what's the word? I lost my English this morning. You have to fire it first in the kiln.
Harden it.
You have to harden it in the kiln. There's a special word for it. I forgot the word. But you have to harden it in the kiln before it's considered to be finished.
Then it becomes a kli.
Then it becomes a kli. But this is the machlokas. Reb Meir says it's a kli once you've finished forming it. And so therefore, forge it. Once you forge it in the kiln. So Amar le Abaye, Mimai, Dilma adkan lo kamer Rabbi Meir hasam ala dechazi lekibulei bei midi. Aval hachal amai chazi lekibulei bei. So Abaye says, how do you know that Reb Meir would agree with our Mishnah that actually making an indentation in a small piece of clay is the creation of a kli? Maybe Rabbi Meir only holds that it's the creation of a kli when you're dealing with a large piece of pottery, because that's like a bowl that has a utility. But making a tiny indentation in a kli, maybe that's not significant enough to hold anything, and therefore, what could you hold in that thing in order to consider it to be a kli? So the Gemara answer is pshiti. The Gemara says, yes, it's still considered to be a receptacle for holding things because you could store your coins there, right? And therefore, I'm thinking like a little ashtray, right? That's enough of a receptacle to be considered a kli. Ika da Amri, others learn, Amar Rav Yosef Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadoki. Others learn that instead of us attributing our Mishnah to Rabbi Meir, Rav Yosef attributes it to Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok. Did nan alfasin charnios tahoros be'ol hameis utumeos b'masa hazav. Now, alfasin charnios, as we'll see in a moment, are crude plates. And what I mean by crude plates is that in city slickers like to have nice plateware. They like to have nice dishware, right, dishes. But if you live in the village, you're a farmer, you don't really care what you eat on, as long as it's a clean surface. It doesn't have to be uniform. It doesn't have to even have a receptacle. As long as just a flat piece of clay, that's sufficient. So because they're flat and they don't have any receptacle, they're not makabel tuma in an ohel, because that's learned from a pasuk that only receptacle concave vessels can become tamei in an ohel, but they do become tamei by being transported by a zav. And Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok Omer after haros b'masa hazav lefishal nigmar malachta. He says no, because they're not receptacles. They're not finished in the sense that they haven't been formed into a receptacle. They're also not makabel tuma from being transported by a zav. But what you see from Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok is that once you form them into a receptacle, then they are makabel tuma even before you forge them in the kiln. Amar le Abaye, Dilma adkan lo kamer Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok hasam ela dechazi lekibulei bei midi aval hachal amai chazi lekibulei bei. Same question that Abaye challenges his Rebbe. He says maybe Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok only holds that a receptacle-shaped piece of pottery is makabel tuma even before it's forged, because it can be used as a utility vessel to hold stuff. But what can such a tiny thing like our Mishnah is talking about, what can it be used to hold? The Gemara answer is pshiti, it could hold coins. Tanu Rabbanon, ein pochsin es haner ve'ein osin alfasin charnios b'yom tov, and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel mater b'alfasin charnios. So you have this machlokes. Are you allowed to create this receptacle for your candle? So the Brisa says you cannot, and furthermore, you're not even allowed to make these villagers' plates. But Reb Shimon Gamliel says you're allowed to make the villagers' plates, because like we explained, there's no receptacle, it's just a flat piece of nothing, and therefore it's not even considered a kli. My charnios, what does the word charnios mean? Amar Rav Yehuda aronios. They mean aronios. So what does that mean? My aronios, Amar Abaye tzoi chakliyasa. It's villagers' plates. It's the farmers' plates, or whatever you want to call it. It's It's the provincial plates, which they're unformed. They don't really have any shape other than just being a surface, and therefore they're not considered a kli. Ve'ein osin pechamim pshita l'may chazi. Next part of our Mishnah, it said that you're not allowed to make charcoal on Yantif. So the Gemara says, obviously you can't. It's muktzah. What would you? Because it's not a kli. What can you use it for? So Tani Rabbi Chia lo nitzracha ela lemosran le'uliyarin lebo bayom. The answer is that you might want to give it to a bathhouse attendant on Yantif to be able to heat up the bathhouse more. Now, I haven't worked in a bathhouse in many years. Actually, I've never worked in a bathhouse. But I'm not really sure exactly what the charcoal is used for, unless you say that, like in the Schwitz, it heats up the water in some way.
It's also
charcoal we could use.
Activated charcoals recognize the preparation.
Activated charcoal
it's a general absorbent. For diarrhea, sometimes it's quite useful.
Yeah,
but I don't think that's what we're dealing with over here.
What it is, charcoal burns hotter and longer.
Yeah. So anyway, so it'll have long-lasting heat, as Mark is saying. So you'll be able to place it somewhere near the water, ostensibly, and that's why you'd want to use it. That's why you'd want to prepare it.
But charcoal in general you could use for a lot of products.
Yeah. So the Gemara asks, Ubo bayom mishari, but still, says the Gemara, since when is it permitted to heat up a bathhouse on Yantif? Because we know that Chazal made a gezerah that you're not allowed to go into a bathhouse on Yantif. Now, we're not going to get into that today. You should know that the Aruch HaShulchan holds that this takana no longer applies because we don't have the standard public bathhouses. But in the Chazal originally made a takana that, putting aside the issue of taking a bath, which Basil holds is usher, but there's an additional problem of going into a bathhouse for a number of different reasons that Chazal were gozer. And the Gemara says, Kida Amarava lahaziyah v'kodem gezerah, hachanami lahaziyah v'kodem gezerah. So the Gemara says that the gezerah was made in different stages. Originally, Chazal were gozer, that you cannot go into the bathhouse to take a bath. But you could go into the bathhouse tamazoi. And then they saw that people were still abusing the halacha, and so therefore they said you can't even go to the bathhouse to take a shvitz. So therefore, we're at the stage historically where you might have wanted to manufacture coal to heat up the bathhouse to generate steam before Chazal asered that. And the chiddush of the Mishnah is that you're not allowed to do that, even though there's some functionality to the charcoal on Yantif. Nevertheless, it's aser because you're creating a kli. Next, ve'ein choschen es apsila l'shnayim. You're not allowed to cut a wick into two, but what you are allowed to do, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is you're allowed to burn it into two. So the Gemara asks, Maishna b'sakin delot kamasakin mana, bo'or nami kamasakin mana. So for the Gemara, why is there this distinction? What's the problem? You can't use a knife because you're creating a new wick. It's like a new vessel, a new utensil. So the same thing is true if you cut it with fire. What difference does it make? So the Gemara answers, Tani Reb Chia choscha be'or b'fi shtei neiros. The answer is that what you do is you take this long wick, you stick one end into one lantern and the oil holder. You stick the other end into the other oil holder. So now what you've got is you've got two lanterns which connect, and you just light a match and burn it so that it separates like that. The reason why that's not called creating a kli is that it's not conspicuous that you're doing it to create a kli, because it looks like you're just lighting two lanterns. And therefore, doing it in that fashion where there's no conspicuous creation of two wicks, because the wicks are already inserted into the lanterns, that's okay.
If they're inserted, why couldn't you now cut it? Because now you can see.
Because cutting it looks like you're fixing something. But when you light it, it just looks like you're lighting the lanterns. Okay. So Amar Rav Nasan Bar Abba Amar Rav Mochtin Asapsila B'Yom Tov. He says you're allowed to do an act called Mochtin to a wick. My Mochtin Amar Rav Chanina Bar Shalmia La'aduye Chushcha. It's to remove any excessive char at the tip of the wick. Now, if there's a small amount of char, that actually helps it ignite more quickly. But if there's a long piece of charred wick, that could inhibit the lighting, and that's what you're allowed to do. You're allowed to remove any excessive char. Tani bar kapara vav dvarim nemru b'pesila gimel hachmer v'gimel hakel. There were 6 halachas stated in reference to a wick. 3 are chumras and 3 are kulas, and here they are. Lahachmir, the 3 chumras are, ein godlin osa lechatchila b'yom tov, you're not allowed to twist a wick on Yontif. Ve'ein mahavhavin osa ba'or, you're not allowed to singe it in order for it to be more easily ignited. Ve'ein choschen osa l'shnayim, and you're not allowed to cut it in half in order to make it 2 shorter wicks out of 1 long wick. And lahakel, the 3 leniencies are, memacha biyad, you're allowed to squash it or to compress it with your fingers. I guess that'll make it more a stronger flame. V'shora b'shemen, you're allowed to soak it in oil. And the third one is v'choscha b'or b'fishtei neros, you are allowed to, after inserting both ends into 2 candles, you're allowed to ignite it so that it'll cut in half. V'amar of Nasan bar Abba Amarav Atirei Bavel, and I guess the only reason that this is connected is because it's the same man, the Amar of Nasan bar Abba, in the name of Rav. Atirei Bavel Yordei Gehenim Heim. The wealthy men of Bavel are destined to descend into Gehenna. This is basically a curse because these are bad people. Now, what does he mean by this? Kihad Shabtai bar Marianus Ikla leBavel. There was once a story about this man from Eretz Yisrael. He came to Bavel. Ba'aminayu iska v'lo yavile. He was looking for a job and no one gave him any work. Mizone mezin nami lo zinu. Then he was looking for a meal and no one would feed him. So Amar Hani me'erev Rav Ka'asu dichsiv v'nasan lacha rachamim v'richemcha, that he said these Jews of Bavel must be descended from the Erev Rav. They're not descended from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Why? Because the pasuk says that God will give you, the Jewish people, rachamim. God instills a quality within the descendants of the Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov with the midah of rachamim. It says, "Kol hamerachem ala brios biyadua shu mizar shel Avram Avinu, v'chol mi she'enu merachem ala brios biyadua she'enu mizar shel Avram Avinu." That anyone who is merachem, who is merciful to others, then you can be sure that he's a legitimate descendant of Avram. But if he's cold and he's cruel and he's brazen and not brazen, but he's an achazari, he's cruel to other people, so then you know that he's not there's something wrong with his lineage. Va'amar Rav Nasan bar Abba Amar Rav Kol hametzapa al shulchan acherim olam choshech ba'ado. He also stated that if a person is constantly looking at someone else's table to see where he's going to get his meal from, meaning that you're a dependent on others for your parnasa, so then the world is dark for that person. Oh my goodness, it's a terrible feeling. Shenemar no deit hu lalechem ayeyada kinachan biyado yom choshech. That if a person has to wander for bread and he doesn't know if his hands are fixed, meaning that if he doesn't know if he's secure, then the world is dark for him. The day is dark. Reb Chisda Omar af chayav einam chayim. Reb Chisda says his life is not a life. It's and the Brisa illustrates this. Tana Rabbanan Gimel chayim einan chayim. There are 3 people whose life is not considered a life. Veiluhein hametzapeh l'shulchan chavero. If a person is anticipating funds based on his friend's table, meaning that he's got to wait for his friend to feed him. Umisha ishta moshelas alav, henpecked husband. If a man's wife rules over him, if your wife rules over you, you also don't have a life, right? Unless she tells you you do have a life, in which case you better say that you have a life, right? Umi, it's the old joke. Two lines in heaven, right? All right, you got it. What?
Say some Ganem.
Right.
Ganem isn't so bad.
That's right. That's true.
Head for a break.
And the third person is a person who is racked with physical pain through his life, and that's also not a life. And some say if you only have one garment to wear, that's also like you don't have a life. And the reason is because the lice accumulate your garment and you're constantly very uncomfortable. The Tanakama, Efshir Dema'ayin B'mani, the Tanakama doesn't hold that that's not called having a life, because he says even if you only have one garment that's infested with lice, you can always pick off the lice one by one. Let's be grateful for our multiple garments. The Mishnah says, we'll just do the Mishnah today, because the first DAF, we were very pressured for time. The Mishnah says, Ein shovrin es hacheres, you're not allowed to break shards of pottery, ve'in choschen haniyar, nor can you cut paper. To do what? Litzlos bo maliach, in order to roast a fish. Now let me just explain. A salted fish has very tender flesh, and it's very susceptible to being burned. So you want to roast this fish, you can't put it directly on the coals, you'll ruin it. So you have to create some insulation between the hot coals and the fish. What you would typically do is put down shards of pottery or pieces of paper, and you would put that between the coals and the fish that you're roasting. But in order to do that, if you don't have any available shards and you want to break those shards on Yontif or cut paper on Yontif, we don't allow you to do that because that's like creating a kli on Yontif. It's an Isser D'Rabbanan. Ve'ein gorfin tanur v'kirayim. You're not allowed to sweep out the oven. Again, it's like a tikkun, it's like fixing a kli. Let's say some of the plaster from the oven falls down to the floor of the oven. You can't sweep that out. Avol mechabshin. But you are allowed to compress the earth of the oven so that you have a flatter surface. Furthermore, you're not allowed to take two barrels and bring them together to create like a tripod, is what Rashi calls it, even though it's not a tripod because that by definition is a three-pronged thing. But let's say you want to create a makeshift grill. So you want to put your fire source in the center of these two barrels, and you want to put a pot over the two barrels with the fire coming underneath it in between the two barrels. He says even to create that, by bringing the two barrels together, you're not allowed to do on Yontiv. And ve'ein somchenes hakeder b'bikaas, you're not allowed to take a log of wood to use it to prop up a pot, I guess to make it usable for cooking. And apparently the reason is, the way Rashi explains it, at least in the Havamina, is because you can't move wood on Yontif unless its purpose is for burning. Any other function, it almost sounds like Rabbi Nechemia, but we'll have to take a look at the Gemara. V'chein bedelis. Nor can you prop up a pot with a door. And the question is, what's wrong with that? The door is a kli, so we'll have to see what's going on over here. V'ein manhigen es habehema b'makal b'yomtiv. Nor are you allowed to lead an animal by hitting it with a stick. And the stick, again, ostensibly the problem is that it's a piece of wood which can only be used as fuel, not for any other purpose. Rabbi Shimon says that that's okay. So this whole latter part of the Mishnah really requires further explanation, and that Be'ezras Hashem we'll see tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.